An agroforest is the most sustainable way to grow food, as opposed to how we normally get our food from the supermarkets, where plants and trees are all planted in monocultures to make it easier for harvest. An agroforest mimics a natural system of a forest which combines trees with shrubs, crops of vegetables and/or animals. This regenerative way of growing food reduces the need for fertilizers, pesticides, is much better for improving soil, water retention, increasing biodiversity, but also becoming more resilient because you have multiple crops which you can harvest at different times of the year, spreading out your work, and if you have crops fail, you have other ones that succeed. In this video, we're going to go through my agroforests which have been planted 2 years ago, 4 years ago and 6 years ago, and I'll show you all the different elements and talk about how you can design them yourself. In an agroforest, I like to design from pattern to detail. So the high level design is I have a field which I fence off and then I mark swales along contour. On each swale, I like to plant one species of tree. So for example, in this agroforest, I have 5 swales, which gives me 5 species of tree. So I'll plant a line of one species of tree along each swale, and I plant them with a wider spacing than normally recommended to allow a space for 3 shrubs in between. Each swale will have one type of shrub all the way along. So then you have 5 species of trees and you could have 5 species of shrub, 1 shrub on each row. However, I have grapevines on all my rows because we like to make our own wine. And then along each swale, I have planted each tree to be a different variety. So if I had 10 varieties in each row and I have 5 rows, that gives me 50 varieties of fruit already at different times. For example, the peach tree row actually has 12 types. So there are 12 peaches which are ready at different times, and they're even planted in order of harvest to make it easier for us. In this agroforest, I have a line of peaches, a line of apples, a line of pistachio, a line of cherry, and they are all different varieties as you go along the row. However, if you want to produce food for selling, it might be better just to produce one variety of each species so that you can harvest them all at the same time and then take them to market to sell. But that would be up to you. In an agroforest, to make it more self-sufficient, we need to plant nurse trees. Nurse trees are trees that are planted to support our main cropping trees. And these can be things like this Persian lilac, which actually repels pests. This is a cousin of the neem tree, and you can use the berries to actually make a pesticide. And it's not just trees that we can plant to repel pests. Any type of pest confuser like aromatic herbs can do the job too. So I've got things like this sage and this baby sage and this curry plant planted under trees to help repel pests. And all fruit trees need lots of nitrogen, so we plant lots of nitrogen fixing trees which mine nitrogen from the air and then spread that around as their leaves drop down and their roots die back. A good example is this tagazaste here, this river tamarind, and this honey locust. Another nurse tree are ones that attract our pollinators, such as this bottlebrush tree that's great for attracting bees, as well as shrubs like this geranium plant here, and our flower meadow that we have between the top 2 swales. I like to focus planting my trees for attracting beneficial insects and pollinators around the edges of my agroforest, because that way when we walk past it or people drive past it, they can enjoy all the flowers. And generally every bush or tree will flower at a different time, so we always have a big tree or bush in flower. And by focusing on trees rather than small plants, you actually end up having a lot more flowers to attract these beneficial insects. Another nurse tree can be one that attracts beneficial insects, and these are insects that eat the pests that cause problems on our trees, such as this lovely elderberry that's just in flower. Other nurse trees can be things that support in the sense of shade, or dynamic accumulators that bring up nutrients from deep down, as well as biomass accumulators, so basically trees that drop lots of leaves and fertilize the soil. So good examples can be this paulownia that I have here, and also this lovely mulberry. So essentially what we're trying to do in an agroforest is plant a diversity of supporting trees, shrubs and plants that support our main crops to reduce our need for fertilizers, pesticides and herbicides. On my boundaries, I like to plant the companion trees, the nurse trees, to support the garden along with the flowers so it looks nice on the edges. However, we don't need that many companion trees. So what I also plant more variety of yielding trees, or fruit trees or trees for spices around the boundaries where there's a higher diversity of trees. So I can have more diversity in the field. However, my main crops will come from the trees along the swales. In my agroforests, I like to plant the trees along the contour line, known as contour planting, and this helps with soil erosion and water retention. So the plants are planted along the contour line, which means they're not planted going up and down the hills, they're planted level, so the line follows the terrain level, not going uphill or downhill, which makes the lines curvy. What we actually do along these contour lines before we plant them is we dig these swales. So these swales here are ditches along the contour line, and the soil from the ditch goes on a mound downhill from the ditch. And what these swales do is capture water that would normally run off down the slope in the middle of the field, but instead it catches all the water in each of the swales along the field and spreads the water uphill. So that keeps the water higher up in the landscape. When it rains, if there's any erosion between the swales, the topsoil and organic matter fills up in this ditch, and that becomes compost, which feeds the trees. So this is the best way to plant trees along swales on contour in your fields. The huge advantage of planting the trees in lines, even though they're not straight because they follow the contour, it means that we can put an irrigation line along the trees, which is much easier than if we had them all in random places, and irrigation lines would go everywhere, making it really impossible to manage the land between the lines of trees. In the agroforests, we like to plant our trees on swales, but we have the lines of swales quite far apart, so the lines of trees are further spaced than you would in a monoculture. And what that's doing is creating an alley between the swales. It's in these alleys that we can plant alley crops. So alley crops can be anything such as vegetables, perennial vegetables, shrubs, grains, or cover crops. So here right now, I'm growing a cover crop, which is to improve the soil, which we can cut back and use the biomass as mulch around our trees. But I can also plant here vegetables such as potatoes and cabbages and beans, which are the common ones that I do, and grains to be used for the animals. The advantage of this alley cropping is that when we bring compost in for the crops here, and when we irrigate the crops here, they also feed and water the trees in the lines of swales. So the vegetables and alley crops help the trees, and also the irrigation and fertilizers for the trees help the alley crops, and the trees add shade for the alley crops in the hot summers here in Portugal, and they drop their leaves, helping increase the biomass for the vegetables. So by integrating our vegetable plantations with our tree plantations, we're creating more of a natural ecosystem which helps each other. In my agroforests, I like to incorporate animals. We can use chickens, sheep, or any type of animal. And what the advantage is they go through and weed for us. So that reduces the need for weeding or herbicides, but they also leave manure as they go, so they fertilize for us, reducing the need for fertilizers. And that they also can eat fallen fruit, which reduces pests as they breed in rotten fruit, which means we don't have to go around picking the fruit. The sheep actually help us prune the trees as well. So incorporating animals into an agroforest really helps. And when we do that, we call it a silvopasture. Silvo meaning trees and pasture meaning food for animals. When we have things like sheep in an agroforest, we have to prune the trees so they're a bit higher, so it's harder to harvest, so the sheep don't damage them. And when we have things like these little chickens in the agroforest, we don't want to plant ground covers that they will destroy. What we have noticed is chickens do not eat asparagus. So I've got asparagus all in my food forest here, and the chickens don't eat it. So actually combining chickens with a asparagus plantation is a really good idea, because they'll weed around it, not eat it, and fertilize as they go. In an agroforest, we need to design in a windbreak. And this is because the wind actually dries out the soil more than the sun. So we want to reduce the wind by planting a windbreak. Usually we will plant a line of deciduous trees to grow big and create a wall to stop the wind. But what I like to do is stagger the trees so that they can grow to their full potential as big specimen trees that block the wind between them. Ideally, I'd have a single row first of smaller shrubs, followed by a row of larger trees, and then another row of shrubs to tackle the wind at different layers to spread the energy of the wind over multiple trees for less wind damage. And reducing the wind will also reduce the damage to your trees in your agroforest. A windbreak predominantly consists of evergreen trees which keep their leaves all year round. But we do have to consider if they're going to cause a problem by blocking the sun to trees as well. We can also incorporate deciduous trees into our windbreak. In this area, I've got some evergreen trees such as this Tagazaste, which is a smaller shrub or a smaller tree, and this also acts as a nitrogen fixer. Then I have over here a holm oak, which is a native tree, and it's really good as it's fire resistant and grows very big. And then here I have a Mediterranean cypress, which is not as big, but very tall, but it's great because it's a really good fire resistant tree. And then behind these, I have these cedars, which grow really fast. And I've got 4 different types in one line. For the deciduous trees, I have a larger ash tree, which can be used for fodder for the animals or firewood. And a small tree or big shrub, this quince, that also gives us a nice fruit. Or this large deciduous shrub, hazel, which produces a lovely nut. And this larger deciduous sweet gum tree. The way I like to plant windbreaks is to stack the windbreaks in space and time. So I plant slower growing trees such as this oak that will eventually give a nice big windbreak with a native tree, and then faster growing shrubs to give us a windbreak really quickly, such as this Tagazaste, and then smaller, slower growing shrubs such as this strawberry tree that will be here permanently, another slow growing oak with behind it some other shrubs such as the quince and juniper berry bush, but then really fast growing trees such as this ironwood tree, which is quite ugly, but it grows super fast and gives us a windbreak really quickly. So this and the Tagazaste give us a windbreak now, and the slower growing trees such as the oaks, Mediterranean cypress, and some of the longer lived shrubs will take over when I chop this down for firewood. And just so you can understand the speed, all of these were planted 5 years ago, and you can see how much bigger this ironwood tree. And also these cedars were planted 7 years ago, and you can see how big they are already. It's really important to think about designing in fire resistant trees into your windbreak, as normally fire travels with wind. So where your windbreak is where the fire is going to come from. So we can also incorporate fire resistant fruit trees such as figs and loquats into that area, because that may help if a fire does come. So an agroforest is a man-made forest that's planted in a way that allows us to have a higher yield of growing things like fruit and trees combined with vegetables, grains or animals to create a more natural system that produces a reasonably high yield, unlike a food forest, which is much more diverse and gives us a large selection of different types of food, but not so much of a high yield of one type of food. However, the more diverse our agroforest is, the more it mimics nature and the more resilient it would be. And a highly diverse agroforest is a food forest. But an agroforest can just be one type of tree with one type of vegetable, but ideally you would like to have multiple types to increase that diversity. If you want to learn more, come and visit us in Portugal for a course on food forestry, agroforestry or permaculture.